on the show, I keep coming back to Titanic. I'm going to be doing at least one Titanic episode, probably March or April, just because, one, they're popular, but two, I enjoy making them so much. And I've found so much history around it because making the food from the Titanic has allowed me to tell stories that aren't necessarily food driven, but stories about individual passengers on the ship, because there are so many stories. The group of Chinese passengers that were on the ship. I'll
Yes.
make a dish from the third class so I can talk about them. The Japanese gentleman who was on the ship and the devastating aftermath that took place because he survived. There's so many stories I want to tell, and making food is just the entry point.
Titanic Talk with Nelson Aspen and Alexandra Boyd. Here we feature stories from the independent documentary Ship of Dreams Titanic Movie Diaries and everything to do with the iconic ship. From James Cameron's epic, groundbreaking movie to the history and legacy of Titanic herself. Actors, historians, authors, descendants and fans come here to talk about Titanic. This is your first-class ticket to everything aboard the Ship of Dreams.
I'm Nelson Aspen, and I'm very excited to be with my co-host Alexandra Boyd for another episode of Titanic Talk. And today's is actually combining three of my passions: food, history, and Titanic. And Alexandra has engaged us with a very special guest star to discuss all three of those subjects. Alex?
Well, hello, and thank you. It's lovely to be back here talking to everyone about Titanic. I came across the amazing Max Miller because the algorithms, I'll say it again, because the algorithms of YouTube and such draw you together. If you say Titanic, eventually you're going to bump up against another Titaniac. And Max Miller is not just a Titaniac. He is the most amazing food historian, which, reading his book, which I have here, you must get. As Nelson pointed out, if you love history and you love food, you have to get this book, because I am learning so much from this incredibly well-researched book about food from the Roman times and food from the, American original settlers or English settlers in the US, and food from England that I didn't know about. Obviously, we know about, Christmas puddings and stuff, but the breadth and depth of his knowledge is incredible. And when he comes to talk to us, I also want to talk to him about the Great British Bake Off, because I believe that's what's up to the whole damn thing. And I am a huge fan. Max Miller, welcome to Titanic.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I want to go back a little bit before we get it, because you've done a trove of Titanic menu items, but tell us a little bit about Great British Bake Off, because it's one of the things I sit down in September and start with the 12 contestants and follow them all the way. There are tears, there's laughter. I love it. Tell me a little bit about how it drew you into the world of food and food writing.
Yeah, so I had really never cooked or baked or done anything in the kitchen until I watched that show. And I was just so inspired by the charm of it. And so in the early seasons, after the episode, they would have an additional episode where Mary Berry and Paul Hollywood would teach you how to bake one of the things that they had baked on the show. And so I just started watching that and started baking everything that they baked. So I didn't teach myself. They taught me through the screen how to bake. And in those original seasons, Mel and Sue, who were the hosts, would talk about the history of some of the things that they were baking. And I just loved it. That's kind of what got me into it, because I'm a history nut. And so they ended up getting rid of that segment when it got big in the US. And that's why I was like, well, if they're not going to do it, I'll do it. And so that's what started Tasting History.
You really did. I remember vividly my 8th grade English history teacher that she, I mean, it's the direct correlation with my love for English history, was Agnes Hay. I remember her name. But what was your impetus for history? Were your family history lovers, or was there a particular teacher? What was the connection?
There's so many, because my family are all history lovers. My mother was a humanities teacher, so she taught everything in one class. It was history and architecture and art and literature and just kind of culture and everything. But the kind of my earliest memories of history were listening to my grandfather's stories of growing up during the Depression and the Dust Bowl and his time during World War II in England and France and Germany. And he told the stories in such a wonderful way that was accessible to a 6 and 7 year old, that it's just, that is how I like to learn history. And so that's now how I like to teach history too.
Yeah. Well, you're a great storyteller now, and Alexandra and I, of course, are just selfishly Titaniacs. What was the first drawing card to you for anything related to Titanic?
So I actually got into Titanic via modeling. I loved model ships growing up.
Oh, I thought you were like Tyra Banks kind of model.
Yes, yeah. That would have been the.
I was like,
answer,
well, Max,
no.
I don't know how tall
Model
you are, but you
ships.
certainly could be a model.
Yeah. No, model ships. I love these model ships. And one day when I went to one of the stores, they had a 3-foot Titanic. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. And I remember getting it for Christmas. It's like one of those few Christmas gifts that I just vividly remember. And in the booklet about how to put together the model, they had tons of history. And by the next Christmas, I think I had every single book that had ever been written on the Titanic. I had watched, every version of A Night to Remember 1,000 times, and that's just kind of how I got into it.
It's strangely I don't know if addictive is the right word, but I know I really didn't I was obviously aware of Titanic and the story of it in culture and in history, but of course I didn't delve into it until I was cast in, well, I was about to be cast. I went and sort of researched a first class passenger through Nelson, because he was already a Titaniac and had a shelf full of books and videos. So that was my gateway into Titanic. And now, having been part of that huge phenomenon that's James Cameron's Titanic, it's sort of grown into this. There seems to have been a resurgence, I think, because of the 25-year anniversary, and because there are so many young people who are drawn into this story. And I think it goes back to some of the real history buff Titaniacs who more lean into the facts rather than the romance of the film. Some of them miss the point that the film was the way that many young people were really impassioned about the true story of Titanic once they realized that it was more than a movie. Did that sort of layer in for you when you saw the film the first time?
Oh yeah. I mean, so my friend Kay, I was a freshman in high school when it came out, and my friend Kay and I went to go see that movie dozens of times, probably in the
Funny how
first
that
few
is,
months.
isn't it?
Oh, one of those.
It was one of those movies, and part of it was, the romance aspect was fine and all, but part of it was getting to see this thing that I had been studying and learning about for so many years come to life in front of my eyes, unlike any other version. I had seen the made-for-TV versions and the original Night to Remember and everything, but the James Cameron one was so realistic and so just put you there. It yeah, it kind of reinvigorated that love of Titanic that's never really gone away.
I mean, kids are like that with pyramids, castles, but there is something
Dinosaurs.
about the Titanic itself. I mean, it's such a terrible, terrible, world-changing tragedy, and yet it's something that kids like ourselves gravitate toward from an early age, which I think is really curious. And now we've all seen, perhaps even in that little booklet that came with your model that Christmas, we've all seen the menu. We all, we hear about the menu on the last night of Titanic, and they're always up for sale, and there are reproductions, and people are doing dinner parties.
And everyone knows that Alexandra wants one of those little star clip things with the silver base. The Titanic
to hold the menu holder.
The collectors are looking out for one for me because it sat on the table in front of me when I sat next to the captain, next to Bernard Hill, and I was just fascinated, not just by the menu because they reproduced and reprinted the menu, but this beautiful, totally on point little menu holder. Anyway, that's my thing. You can carry on, Nelson.
Well, I mean, the menu is well known. In fact, I pulled up just Google image search Titanic menu. Boom, there you've got it. But when did you make the connection to food as it relates to Titanic, Max?
So that came with a cookbook that I found at like a secondhand store, and I can't even remember where it was. But it was a cookbook called Last Dinner on the Titanic. And
I think I've seen that. And it's got a beautiful Edwardian painting on the front.
Yes. And it's rather old. And when I say old, I mean, I think it's from the 80s or early 90s.
I'm out of here.
Which is, but that's the oldest.
Nelson, come back.
That's the oldest book on Titanic food that I could find.
Good catch. Good save. Good save.
Well played. Well played.
And so it's not as old as I am. But so this book had many modernized recipes from the Titanic, and it also had a lot of information, as it's still around, has a lot of information about the culinary life on the ship, people who were cooking, how people ate, the processes, and all of that. And so that was just like, oh, here's another book on the Titanic. And then I read that. Now, this was long before I got into cooking. So I didn't make anything. I didn't do that really until the show. And my thing on the show is finding period recipes. Well, there are no period recipes from the Titanic in existence, but there are recipes from that period that are on those menus, Escoffier in general. So I was able to remake them as they would have been back then, because the cookbook is much more modern versions.
Yes, and I have to say, as a British person who's grown up with Americans scoffing and sneering at English food, sometimes when I read those menus, when I see boiled beef and carrots, I'm like, oh gosh, yes. But honestly, we do a little bit better than that, as evidenced by British Baking Show, or Jamie Oliver and all of the people who've come since, who've like, look, we've got to do something about English cooking because we've got such a bad rep. And I think it's evolved. You can see, for me as an English person, I can see how from that menu even our tastes literally have evolved over the last 100 years or so.
Oh, and yet absolutely. Everything old is new again. Like as like, I'll just place myself as a typical American eater. So, you'll look at something off that menu and go, oh, vegetable marrow farci, like what the hell with the marrow? And you think that would be disgusting. I'm so glad we have evolved. But then like we just got back from a trip to Paris, and we ate all these amazing foods, but it's really the same. The foods have not changed. Maybe the style in which they're prepared have. Speak to that. Like if you have a copy of the menu in front of you, like if you could just mention some of the foods that were on the Titanic menu and what we would think of them now. Would we enjoy them? How would you prepare them?
So when it comes to the foods on the Titanic that I think we would still enjoy today, there are plenty, but it's not just first class dishes. It's you get to see all of the different classes, and I think that we probably more enjoy many of the third class dishes than the first class.
Give me the
But
fish and
things from the
chips.
yeah, things from the first class menu that we're not necessarily, um, we don't know today by these names. We still have versions of them, like punch romaine. You know, it's it's like a sherbet with alcohol in it, and there's no reason that that wouldn't be something that you could find on a nice dinner table today, and it's absolutely wonderful. The cream of barley soup, it's it if you look back at the old recipes from the early 20th century for this soup, it's absolutely wonderful. We don't think of barley today as something that we would want, but think of any other cream soup. It's more the cream that you're tasting. Um, the vegetable marrow farci, it's actually the marrow is the vegetable. It's not bone marrow. It's a kind of a gourd called a marrow, and it's nothing like, I mean, we would eat the same thing today. It's just that they use different terminology back then. Now, when you look at um, the third class menu, that's when you start to see some things that, when we think of that kind of English food that is not necessarily the best,
You can say
you
it. You
start.
can say it. I'm thick-skinned.
I actually don't mind English food. I think a lot of the hate about English food comes from the years of rationing,
Yes.
because America, we only rationed for a few years. England was rationing for like 25 years. So,
Powdered egg and
yeah,
no meat. Everyone was practically vegetarian. Like a teaspoon of sugar per person per
exactly,
week.
exactly. Everything was in tins and whatnot. But the third class meals, those were more typical of what the common people were eating, like the roast beef and brown gravy and boiled potatoes and sweet corn. It's basic stuff, and it wouldn't be all that different from how we are eating today. But then you find those few dishes that are like, oh, well, that is different, like the rice soup, which I did make on the channel. Basically, it is just rice that has been boiled in milk and water to within an inch of its life, but it's flavored with cayenne pepper, which is something that you wouldn't think of as a typical English fare. But if you look at English recipes pre-World War One, there was a lot more spice used, a lot of nutmeg and cinnamon and cayenne pepper and mace. You lose that in World War One. So a lot of these dishes would actually be a lot more spiced than we would typically eat today.
And they'd have
Um,
filtered back from the Raj from India as well. We'd have,
exactly. Well, and that's why
people would
they
have
were
come
so
back and
spiced.
gone, we had a sprinkle of nutmeg on our rice pudding. And
Yeah.
my father, was from Edinburgh, they didn't eat sweet porridge. They didn't put sugar in their porridge. They put salt on their porridge. It was a savory dish, and to get that nutrition of the oats inside you. He actually
Yeah.
historically and famously hated porridge oats. As a Scotsman, everyone just thought that was
Well,
sacrilege.
it was more like a hasty pudding, which was, a savory version of porridge, and it was, sometimes they would sweeten it with like molasses, which is not that sweet, and things like that. But it was definitely probably more with the salt and everything like
You
that.
said, speaking of pudding, the Waldorf pudding. What is that? I'm curious about that because I like a Waldorf salad. Is what's in a Waldorf pudding?
So I am not entirely sure what's in Waldorf pudding, but I do know it has nothing to do with the
Walnut.
salad. Um, but it probably comes from the same it probably comes from the same place, which is it's named after the hotel.
Right.
But I'm not entirely sure because that again, that's a recipe that was on the Titanic, but is not in many of the other old cookbooks, at least that I've been able to find.
And I'm sure
Otherwise,
that's a
I would
challenge for you.
appreciate it.
One thing that struck me reading Tasting History was that you're very clear that there were no there are lists of ingredients but no measurements. So you're
Yeah.
relying on somebody, the Mrs. Bridges in the Victorian kitchen. I can't remember the name of the cook in Downton Abbey, but I'm showing my age by
Oh, yes.
Mrs. Bridges from
Miss
upstairs.
Patmore.
Yes, there you go. That she would know the measurements, but what she'd have learned that coming up in the kitchen and from a scullery maid or a kitchen maid. There were no measurements, so you were very much relying on your instinct. And you're like, well, like when I make a Yorkshire pudding, I finally found out that if you do exactly the same measurements of flour, egg, and milk, like it's 1 cup of milk, 1 cup of flour, and then fill up the cup with as many eggs fit in there, whoosh it all together, there's your Yorkshire pudding. But I spent years going, is it how many ounces and how many this and that? That sort of judging by eye, and then you become an instinctual cook when you can put away the recipe book because you've cooked something so many times. So that must have been a challenge for you, recreating these recipes that have no measurements to them.
Right. Especially when it comes to the first class menu, because most of the first class dishes come from Auguste Escoffier, who was kind of the person who created fine dining as we know it today. It was the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was the chef at the Savoy in London and then at the Ritz in London and Paris. So most of the dishes are in his cookbook. But his cookbook was very much written for a professional cook in a French or English kitchen. So it's like make a béarnaise, and that is the extent of his instruction. So there's a lot of kind of going back and figuring out and guessing what they would have had and everything. So like the peaches and chartreuse jelly, which is one of the desserts at that last dinner in first class. He talks about how to make chartreuse jelly, but with very few specifics, and how the peaches are incorporated. There are no descriptions, there are no pictures or anything like that. I think Isabella Beaton has a lot of pictures of different jellies in her cookbook, but nothing specifically the peaches and chartreuse jelly. So it's kind of pulling from multiple sources to put this together. But then you end up with something that very likely would have been eaten on the Titanic.
And listen to you saying jelly. I don't think I've eaten jelly since school dinners. They sort of very much went out of fashion. I think
Right.
it's just a way to get children to. Gelatin was supposed to be good for your nails and hair. And again, during the wartime, it was probably a very cheap and quick and easy way to get children to eat something that had some kind of nutrition in it.
Yeah, and it was left over. So in the 18th and especially 19th and early 20th century, having a jelly or jello, basically, for us Americans, um, on the table, that was a statement piece because it wasn't there necessarily for the fact that it tasted great. It was there because they would make them in these molds that would be works of art. If you see some of the pictures, these things could be several feet tall and have different things inside of them and different colors swirling throughout them. So it was a piece of art on your table. And if you had that, it usually meant that you had the money to have private cooks in your house who know how to do these things. And you had the money and time to make gelatin from horse hooves or cattle hooves, which is extremely time consuming. So
and
powdered
not vegan.
gelatin didn't come around until a little bit
I know
later.
vegans who won't eat Jello. They're like, "Oh, I got to go to the hospital for surgery, but I can't eat Jello because
Yeah,
Jello is not vegan."
yeah,
I remember my grandmother had the copper Jello molds on her kitchen walls. Do you remember the
Very
Jello?
collectible.
they're
Yes.
beautiful,
So
absolutely beautiful. And that's actually I used one of those that I had found at an antique store to make the chartreuse jelly, and it was only about this big, and it still took forever to make. Some of the old ones, they're feet high. They're absolutely massive.
Max, your show
Um,
is Tasting History is such a fan favorite. I've been telling people, oh, we're going to talk to Max, and everybody knows of Tasting History, and everybody thinks you're terrific, and everybody
oh,
knows
thank you.
your on-camera routine. But what about off-camera at home? For those of us that are going to get to see this podcast on YouTube as opposed to just listening to it on other venues, we're getting to see your kitty cat. So that's
Yes.
that's a treat. So when you're at home,
Oh, that's so cute.
do you
This
cook
is
for
Milo.
fun at home? Do you cook for the cat?
I do not cook for the cats. I rarely get to cook for myself. Usually all of my cooking is just for the show and testing for the next week, especially when something goes wrong. Um, Honestly, Tasting History is kind of my life. Uh, there is very little time that I spend not thinking of Tasting History. When I do a lot of Lego at home because I have the wonderful Lego Titanic actually up in my office. It kind of is the only time that I can step away and not specifically think about the show. I mean, it is a full-time job, and it's just kind of always in my head because there are just so many
And
different
what were you
aspects.
doing prior to that? Because I know this is a fairly recent thing that just sort of blew up into this incredible YouTube presence and
Yeah,
book
I
deals and stuff.
started at the beginning of the pandemic, and before that I was working at Walt Disney Studios in distribution, selling films and marketing films. So very, very different change of pace.
Yes.
Um, but
What was it like
yeah,
that day you looked at your boss and said, "I'm quitting because I have a YouTube." You go,
I
what?
didn't have that because I didn't really have that because I had the day where my boss said, "Everyone, there's a global pandemic. Everyone go home and don't come back." Um, Not a lot of movies were coming out, so I went on furlough, and by the time I was ready to go back to work, the channel had taken off, and so I was able to, again, over the phone, say, "No, I won't be coming back."
Good for you.
Congratulations.
But
I think there's nothing, Nelson and I talk about that a lot. And my partner, I like working for yourself or having something that you're super passionate about that actually has created a living for you is something really unique and special.
And do what you love, or
Yeah,
else,
it
you just
everything
do
else will
what you love.
come. Yeah.
it
Yeah.
is. I do love it. I mean, the only drawback is that it is all consuming, and that's really on me, and that it is hard to, it's a 7 day a week, morning till night job in some way or another. Even when I'm on vacation, we go places so I can do research for upcoming episodes,
It's
which
a
I
tax
love. But
write-off, right?
you know,
See, it's a business expense. You have
yeah,
to go
exactly. I
through.
miss having coworkers. The cats are great, but the conversation is less than stimulating. I miss seeing people and getting out of the house. I have to force myself to go, like, I'm going to go to the post office today just so I can see another human. So I do miss that aspect
Well,
of
Max,
having a
if I
real
said to
job.
you, where do you want to go for dinner? Like, what does Max Miller like to eat for dinner that you don't have to make, that doesn't have to mean anything? What are your taste buds telling you?
It's usually Thai or Japanese. We do a lot of Thai food, and Mexican food. I grew up in Phoenix where we had Mexican food like 5 nights a week, and so I don't do 5 nights a week anymore for my waistline, but we eat a lot of Mexican food.
Do you find, Max, and I talking about the pandemic and not being able to go out, I've always loved cooking, and often, as a filmmaker, I haven't had a lot of money making independent films to go out and eat all the time. And I found the one pot cooking books by Rukmini Iyer. She lives in East Dulwich, where I used to live in London. And I just sort of find a cookbook and just start, flicking through the pages, like, I'll do this tonight, because you had to you had to eat in. And I will say I have become quite a good cook as a result. And it's really hard now. And we do live quite remotely. We're not close enough quite to Seattle to go there once a week. But I find, like, if this food isn't as good as I can cook at home, I don't want to pay for it, even if somebody else is doing the washing up. Do you feel, I mean, when you have to make a recipe over and over, you have to practice it so that you can present it. Do you feel a little bit like now, like, you're tasting something like, this better be good?
Um, I mean, I obviously always want good food, but I find a lot can be said about the ease of going to a restaurant.
Serve
I'm
me.
like,
I don't
yeah,
want to
I
clean
maybe I
it
could
up.
make this better, but it would take
Serve
me
me.
hours. I don't have to clean up. I don't have to, I appreciate a restaurant very much. And the thing, what I am is a creature of habit. So I found those restaurants that I know that I like the food, and we just go over and over and over again. We have like 5 restaurants. We're
Yes.
not super, only when we travel do we get really adventurous. We live in Los Angeles, and it's like you have so many amazing restaurants that I never go to.
Yes.
Well, you certainly can't go to El Coyote every night.
Well, that's also the thing. I mean, restaurants here are kind of insane. So we like the hole in the wall Mexican and Thai place. That's just what we enjoy.
Yes.
Tell us what's coming up. What are you working on? What are the upcoming episodes of Tasting History? And what are some of your favorite episodes that we can check out that in case there's a particular one that you're really proud of?
Yeah. So I'm actually really proud of the one that I just dropped today. It's on Jane Austen and when breakfast during her era and what eating breakfast during her era and what time you ate it could tell you about a person and their station in life. Um, I, I, I,
Interesting.
I really enjoy that one. Coming up, I'm working on a lot of things. I'm actually working on an Ottoman recipe right now for a pilaf. Um, so I'll be talking about the Ottoman Empire, and I just finished making lobscouse, which is a dish of meat and vegetables and hardtack or ship's biscuits
You and this
that are
hardtack that keeps popping up. The
Yeah, yeah.
hardtack.
clack clack.
Civil War, Titanic lifeboats. There's always
Yeah.
some hardtack around.
I mean, it shows up all the time throughout history. And this was a food that sailors would have been eating in the 18th and 19th century, mostly in the British Navy, the American Navy, and in other ways, in many of the Scandinavian countries, they still have versions of it. In Liverpool, it's still eaten as scouse. They're actually Liverpudlians are sometimes called scousers
Yes.
because of this dish.
I heard you say Scouse. I was like, that must be from Liverpool. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's very simple, but very filling and delicious, and the history around it is really interesting. And I wish I could say I had a lot more planned, but I'm I don't work that far ahead. I'm trying to get ahead a little bit more, but I do have things like the history of airline food coming up, the history of pet food
Fantastic.
coming up.
Ooh.
Take that, Rachel Ray.
Right.
Give you some pet food.
Some pet food. And I am trying to plan an entire series like I did with Titanic. But this would be food on the home front during World War II, but for many countries. So the US and England, of course, but also Germany, Russia, Japan, some of those countries that we don't get to see what life on the home front was like.
Fascinating,
as much as
especially
we do.
because you were talking to us about the rationing and how that would have been different rationing in different countries, and
Yeah.
it's really fascinating. You're a genius.
Yes,
Well, I wouldn't go
really
that far.
super fascinating. And also I can just tell from the book and from watching your YouTube that really, I say this so much, the tip of the iceberg is what you present based on
Yeah.
your depth and breadth of research, because it's so evident that you don't just pick a recipe and present it. It's really an engaging series and deserves all the success that you have gained from it. So congratulations. We enjoy it very much.
Thank you.
And let's take one moment before we wrap it up, which we're going to have to do momentarily. I just want to bring things back to Titanic for one moment. As a Titaniac yourself, as someone since childhood who has been interested in Titanic, with your Lego model upstairs, which I can't believe your cats wouldn't eat a piece of Lego and you'd find it on the carpet later. That to me is cats and Legos. But how does Titanic fit into your life today? Are you still interested in it? Do you turn on a repeat of the film once in a while?
I'm still immensely into it. I feel like we've watched it probably 3 times in the last 4 years, 3 years since I started the Titanic series. And on the show, I keep coming back to Titanic. I'm going to be doing at least one Titanic episode, probably this March or April, just because one, they're popular, but two, I enjoy making them so much, and I have found so much history around it because making the food from the Titanic has allowed me to tell stories that aren't necessarily food driven, but stories about individual passengers on the ship, because there are so many stories. The group of Chinese passengers that were on the ship. I'll
Yes.
make a dish from the third class so I can talk about them. The Japanese gentleman who was on the ship and the devastating aftermath that took place because he survived. There's so many stories I want to tell, and making food is just the entry point.
Beautifully said.
Fantastic.
We're so grateful to have had you on Titanic Talk, Max. You're part of our Titanic Talk family now. You're stuck with us.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review. And if you'd like to hear more podcasts like this, hit the subscribe button. For information on where you can see Ship of Dreams, Titanic Movie Diaries, go to shipofdreamsfilm.com. Titanic Talk is a production of Ship of Dreams Film Limited. To celebrate Season 2 of Titanic Talk, we've launched a line of Titanic Talk merch. A cap, a mug, a tote, a t-shirt or a hoodie. You'll be sure to find a unique gift for the Titaniac in your life. Look for the link in the notes and on Instagram, or go to bit.ly/Titanic Talk Shop. And Nelson has a new book out. Dancing Between the Raindrops is a steamy page-turner full of all the tales Nelson can still remember from New York City in the 1980s. It's a coming-of-age story about friends in the era of big hair, padded shoulders, and punk rock. Dancing Between the Raindrops is available on Amazon, or ask for it at your local bookstore.